when Sacred Plant Alliance first started meeting, we were terrified to all be on Zoom together back in 2020. And now there's a Psychedelic Bar Association. There are lots of organizations talking about risk reduction or harm reduction services, and that the MAPS conference is going to be as big as it is incredible. That there's so much research.
Welcome to the Mindfulness Experience Podcast, an official podcast for the Psychedelic Science Convention 2023. That's happening in Denver, Colorado from June 19th through the 23rd. My name is Keith Fifeson. On this podcast, I'm thrilled to introduce you to Miss Allison Hoots. Allison is an attorney with Hoots Law Practice PLLC. She has had a diverse experience practicing law, including the legal areas of employment, corporate, contract, employee benefits, tax, and intellectual property. Allison advises companies, nonprofits, religious communities, and practitioners on operations that involve psychedelics, including advising churches on the religious use of sacraments. Allison is also president of Sacred Plant Alliance Incorporated, a self-regulating organization and professional society of spiritual practitioners with religious communities dedicated to the advancement of the ceremonial use of psychedelic sacraments within the United States. She is a member of the Chacruna Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants and the lead author of the Chacruna Guide to RFRA and Best Practices for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. The RFRA is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It is a wonderful guide. I encourage you to download it on the Chacruna website. She embodies the spirit of mindfulness in advocating for the rights to religious freedom and the responsible use of psychedelic sacraments. I'm honored to have Allison as our guest on the Mindfulness Experience, and I'm excited to learn more, as you will be as well, about her experiences and her insights at the intersection of law, spirituality, and psychedelic medicine. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Miss Allison Hoots. Hello, Allison. How are you?
I'm doing great. Hi, Keith.
Wow. Well, I have to say, Allison, I'm very excited that you accepted my invitation to be on the show, and incredibly excited that you are going to be at the MAPS Psychedelic Science Convention 2023. It's going to be a huge convention, and you've got 3 sessions there. So, thank you very much for agreeing to be on the show and talk about your sessions and talk about the work you're doing. How are you?
I'm a little tired as a mom of 2 and a lawyer who's just maybe overly excited about her work and reads articles late at night, making bad decisions in my late 30s. But so happy to be here and talk about what I've been doing and the landscape right now for religious use of psychedelics.
It's wonderful that you have this passion, and you're really the reason I'm so thrilled is we've talked before about my own ministry and my own desire to look at this whole landscape, the psychedelic landscape, and using psychedelics as a sacrament. And you're a professional and you're an advocate in using psychedelic medicine, and you've got a wealth of experience. I'm just wondering if we can dive into some questions I've got around this, because, that's what this is all about. It's the mindfulness experience.
And also, how does someone providing that experience protect participants and also themselves? And that's where the lawyering comes in.
That's where the rigor comes in.
Yeah.
And because otherwise, if you can't stay on the road, if you don't have the right guardrails, and you can get in an accident, and then who knows what'll happen there. But you became interested in this area. Tell me a little bit about what was the interest that you had with this intersection between law and psychedelics and medicine churches? What inspired you to really kind of pursue this whole area and make it your life's work?
Well, I attended a church that used a psychedelic as sacrament. It was 2015, and I was pretty miserable in general. I had gotten all of the things I wanted in life at that time, which was the house and the AM 100 job at a law firm, and just wasn't happy at all. In that way, I think, where people predict what they want and then it's not that. And I ended up having a back injury, and a friend said, I want you to go and experience psychedelics in this other way, in a spiritual, ritualistic way. I attended this church. It was so beautiful and supportive and safe, and I felt supported. And they were in process of incorporating as a church and filing for 501c3 status. And they found out I was a lawyer. And the next thing I knew, I was on the board and I was helping with everything. But in a way that I was very excited to be included in the process. So at that point, I realized there really wasn't that much information out there. There were these cases that I found that existed for these churches. And some people were starting to talk about it, but there really wasn't a lot back in, 2016, 2017. So I ended up researching everything I could and learning about how the cases that protected religious use of a controlled substance could inform corporate, like very, very boring corporate concepts, like language in incorporation documents and what to say in a medical disclosure form or informed consent release document. And, what do you say during ceremony and after ceremony that was consistent with the concepts set out in these cases, which were the UDV and Santo Daime cases. And, in those two cases, RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, was used where the claimants filed claims alleging there was a substantial burden on their religious exercise, and that the government interests were not being furthered by least restrictive means. And the government interests in those cases, which I think are really important to acknowledge, are the health and safety of participants and the government's interest in preventing diversion of the substances to non-religious uses.
Now, those are very, thank you very much. That's a wonderful backstory. So you really got, sort of pulled in.
Yes.
They just wouldn't let you out. They just, and
it was completely voluntary, but I was excited to help. And then I just started getting referred. Next thing I knew, I had a whole bunch of clients doing this work.
That's wonderful. I've had some other guests that have been on the show that have, RFRA, 508c1a status. And you had mentioned a couple of things. Can we just sort of unpack that a little bit when we start talking about the, and oh, by the way, I'd like to lift up the book that you've written that's also about the RFRA and all the requirements around that. But can we maybe just lift that up a little bit?
Sure.
I do think that our listeners may wonder, what is this thing that we're talking about? We're talking about churches, we're talking about sacrament. Obviously the people who might be listening to this are very cued into the whole area of psychedelics as well. But can you maybe unpack that in terms of the health and wellness? Because from my view, that's a very big one, specifically as it relates to the churches and the use of sacrament and the diversion of, obviously, the sacrament itself.
Right. You asked a lot of questions, so let me see if I can go step by step. No, it's all right. So first, I'm on the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicine's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants. There, I collaborated with Bia Labache to work on this book that I sometimes joke was my third baby because it took me about 9 months. And it's called Guide to RFRA and Best Practices for Psychedelic Plant Medicine Churches. It's available for free to download.
I have it printed out. I have it right over here.
Oh, beautiful. And it's where I give away all the milk for free. But I was tired of explaining all the same things to my potential clients. And this is just such an incredible tool to be able to share for people trying to understand some of the very strange nuances of these concepts. But so
I just want to stop for a second and just say thank you so much for this book, because it really is, I mean, it's, I don't know, 200 pages or so.
Oh, I think
pages.
It's 80 something single spaced. So maybe.
Okay. Well, I printed it out on my printer, so
yeah. It was long.
Yeah, it's a big book. It's very big, but
it's dense.
It's such a resource. It really is such a resource. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. But it's important to talk about some of the basics of it, which is, I think a lot of people think, oh, I'm a church now and I'm RFRA compliant, or I have a RFRA status. And that's not true. Only very specific churches in the United States have an exemption from the Controlled Substances Act to use these psychedelic substances as sacrament. And in those cases, it was only ayahuasca. There is a federal law that allows for certain Native American churches to use peyote, but there really isn't anything else except for state regulation or legalization that would allow someone to use it. But even then, there's no federal permission unless you have a clear exemption. So I often have to remind everyone that maybe you are a legal church, meaning you are an entity that is a church, a legal entity, either by organizing as a church is the language under 508, which can mean that you're just organized. You don't actually have to incorporate, or you've incorporated under state law as a church. There are different ways to do that in each state. And then you are a legal entity, but you're not lawfully serving these medicines or sacraments. Instead, you may have the ability to raise a defense or file a claim under RFRA, which is a federal law. And this law basically said that any federal action that creates the substantial burden will be scrutinized using the highest scrutiny, strict scrutiny, using the test that I described before. Was there a substantial burden? Is there sincere religious exercise? Sincere is very important. That's a whole conversation. And has your activity minimized the interests of the government? So the health and safety of participants and diversion. So there are ways in which, and it's in the book, I articulate the ways that was demonstrated in the court cases. And then I make some additional suggestions, which are the best practices.
Right. And one of your sessions is going to be best practices for legally protecting sincere psychedelic medicine churches, right?
Yes. So that is a workshop on Tuesday, which will be about 4 hours. And I just saw it sold out.
That's great.
Which is lovely. And I do lots of talks. This will obviously be a very in-depth one for 4 hours, which I'll be sharing the stage with Bia and Sean McAllister, who's another attorney in the space. And it's going to be a great talk, but just sort of getting into the deeper questions around, we'll have some reference to the guide, but also sort of also with the shifts in the landscape, which have been huge since when I released the book in 2021, November. So a lot has happened.
A lot has happened. And, there's a lot of legal ambiguity around, profit, for example, on the 508c1a. says you can't make more than $500 a year in profit, or there's some, it's not supposed to be a for-profit organization. And yet we see that there are some churches out there, some psychedelic churches, that are not only charging memberships, but also have, courses that they're doing and other programs that they're doing. And I'm just wondering, within the religious context, it would just seem to me that could be a potential challenge, and there would be other challenges that these sincere psychedelic churches might face. Can you speak to some of them in terms of what you think might, because as you said, these aren't DEA, they're not DEA sanctioned. It's not legal, right? I mean, it's not a legal substance.
Yeah.
Using, so.
There are so many issues. One big one is sourcing sacrament, unless you're sourcing domestically. And even so, if your sacrament is psilocybin and you have to cultivate, or even acquiring ayahuasca in a way that is in integrity, all of those things are really difficult to balance, particularly where, Homeland Security is seizing sacrament coming across the border. There have been cultivation spaces that have been raided. So that remains a consistent risk. At the same time, the government demands safety for participants, which is difficult to accomplish if you don't have a safe source of the sacrament that you believe is essential for your rituals. And so, that's an issue. If you are a nonprofit, even if you don't have IRS recognition, as a tax-exempt entity, you are meant to operate consistent with the rules of 501c3. So there are a lot of rules. It's, corporate operations, it's about profit.
Right. You still have to keep the books. You still have to protect the sacrament and your members.
Yes. Yep. And then, you have to get a good lawyer to work on your documents. And I think one thing that is sort of a confusion around being a nonprofit, you can still pay your minister reasonable compensation. You can still have workshops and community events, things that are consistent with your religious beliefs and the purposes outlined under 501c3, which is, charitable efforts, things that give back to your community. All of that is fine. It's meant that, anything that exceeds what you've already allocated within the budget goes back into the church. And there's no bonuses because you had all this profit in the year, because it's a charitable entity that is tax exempt. So you are receiving, what was the government calls it, that they subsidize these charities in a way because they aren't paying taxes. So, and actually there was a case just in the last month by the DC District Court, I believe, and it was the Church of it's Iowa-Osca. So Iowa, they're in Iowa, and they were denied 501c3 status, and they appealed and they were denied. And then they took it to court, and the court said, no, you don't have an exemption. This is illegal activity, which is not permitted under 501c3. And it's against public policy, which is probably one of the most frustrating cases that I've seen come out thus far. I do think that there are lots of ways in which religious use that is safe and doesn't use its sacrament in non-religious ways is consistent with public policy. So, there are these new challenges and issues coming up every month. There are arrests that are happening. I've heard of quite a few recently. And, there's just a lot going on in the whole sphere, just even questioning sincerity of people, right?
So I have a question for you, which might be a bit challenging, but it might take a bit of time. But what are the most effective strategies for protecting the religious liberty of these churches, ensuring that the members have access to the transformative potential, but also have access to the sacraments. So we talk about health, we talk about the sacrament. So what are the sort of the rigor? What's the rigor that organizations should be looking at? Or is there a 5-point plan or something like that that you might have in terms of advice?
Sure. It's 80 pages long and it's in the guide, but in summary, I think some of the most important aspects of operating a spiritual community that uses a sacrament that makes its participants so vulnerable is transparency and support. If you are going to offer these sacraments, you need to be very experienced and talk about your lineage, where you've learned, how you've apprenticed, in what ways you've created support for individuals who experience a spiritual, emotional, mental health difficulty during ceremony or after ceremony. Also, what kind of emergency procedures you put in place to ensure, you can't ensure anything. That's something I always say, don't promise anyone safety, but that you have created procedures and protocol to increase safety. But, just considering all the things that can go wrong. And this is, the part that's the worst about my job is saying, well, this could go very badly because, as we know, that there are these inherent risks with anyone taking anything from an herbal supplement to a prescribed medication to these deeply transformative, intense psychedelic substances. You have to own that risk. And so does the participant. And that's why informed consent is so important. You talk about exactly what you're giving your participants, even if it's saying, the ayahuasca has been brewed with sananga or, with whatever you can share, please share that, because someone has to be able to make an informed and voluntary decision to participate. And you also need to say, I can't guarantee you any specific kind of spiritual experience, mental health experience, especially. That's not what I'm offering here. What I am offering is a ritual that is spiritual and consistent with these religious beliefs. Here are my religious beliefs. They are X, Y, and Z. Like, share that with your participants. And to say, know that you are engaging in a risk. And I'm engaging in a risk, that I'm at risk legally in doing these things. I believe with conviction in these beliefs, and I'm going to offer this ceremony, but I'm at risk criminally and civilly by doing these things. And you need to assume those risks as well if you're going to participate. And as icky as it could seem for someone to say, oh, now I have no rights, that's not true. If a leader or an authorized person breaches a significant duty, there is no agreement that's going to protect them. So, I think there's that safeguard. One thing I just want to mention is the nonprofit that I'm currently president of and on the board of, which is Sacred Plant Alliance. We've been really diving deep into basically potential harms, but also best practices of churches that use an altering substance, a substance that takes you into a non-ordinary state of consciousness that connects you to the divine in such a deep way that you become so vulnerable, and recognizing that we need a space for leaders of these communities to come together and be able to talk about their experiences and address what's going well and what's concerning. And then also, to have that support network within the Sacred Plant Alliance of other leaders. But also, we created an accountability system. And so all members, religious communities of the church, of the Sacred Plant Alliance, now have to include some information to their participants, their members of the religious organization, and say, look, if there's something that we can't reconcile or you feel is egregiously harmful that occurred within our community during a ceremony, etc., you can go to Sacred Plant Alliance and file a complaint that there's been a breach of their ethical guidelines. And what I'm hoping to see more in the space is additional, or, people reaching out to Sacred Plant Alliance, but also additional organizations that want to have this kind of self-governance, because it promotes the safety, I think, of these practices.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely wonderful, and so many good perspectives and insights. I'm just coming out of a psychedelic assisted therapy provider program with MAPS and IPI. And, I'm sort of cradling or sitting on both sides of the fence here, looking at, and I've talked to, Sanctuary and G.V. Friedman and his operation, and I've looked at various other areas as well. But my real concern is that, there's a sort of a standard rigor, that you'd see in the assisted therapy area, where you have intake and you have a medical assessment, then you have dosing, and you have the obviously the concerns if something goes wrong, there's a team here to go ahead and take care of whatever, and then you have integration, which is really pivotal, but you're able to weed out and really take care of people that might not be, whether or not it's a heart issue or whether or not there's some psychological problem that would not be appropriate for the medicine. So it sounds like that's what you're doing with the Alliance. And I think that kind of rigor is really wonderful to see.
Those are a lot of the same things that I recommend in the religious use practices, is to do medical screening. It's a lot of the same. And I work with individuals who provide support during journeys as well, and also therapists that work with different kinds of substances. And, a lot of it is very much mirrored that we want to see in all of these lanes, whether it be therapeutic or spiritual. And, even in the recreational space, there should be some legal treatment such that someone could feel comfortable saying, like, I had this terrible experience with this person, even though the substance was involved, and not feel that there's going to be, or I guess fear that there's going to be repercussions on themselves for coming forward about it.
Yeah, and I really believe, and I was just in a group, we're doing a weekend retreat, and someone said, and I really believe it's true, that the medicine is really not only in the individual, but in the witnessing and the container within the community. So, often, people will get, a sense of transformation, a sense of being witnessed, a sense of relief of trauma, and so on and so forth, even if they don't have the medicine. A sense of just being witnessed, to be seen, to be heard, to be recognized, to be able to go deep, and to be able to, do their process. And that's what the medicine helps with, is it helps individuals work through whatever their process is. And in some cases, obviously, achieve, this transpersonal perspective where they're able to have a spiritual experience, a sacred experience of the ineffable. So.
Right. No, and I think I've said lots of times that I think in every experience with a non-ordinary state of consciousness, there is something recreational, there's something spiritual, and there's something therapeutic. It just depends which lane you're coming in from. But ultimately you do experience all three. And I also know from being a helper during ceremony that I've, even very not altered, that I do experience like a deep sense of spirituality and experience, even not on medicine, having taken a sacrament. So yeah, there's the communal aspect can be, not psychedelic, but transformative,
Right.
and very powerful.
Yeah, and I think that's what Groff was talking about. I'll be
Mm.
in his workshop, by the way. I was one of the
Lovely.
lucky ones to get into that
I
workshop.
saw that sold out as well. Yeah. And I work with breathwork facilitators, and a lot of it is the same in those agreements as well. This is going to be an intense experience. It doesn't have to be altered by an external substance, although for a lot of people, they believe that is necessary, or is very integral to the ceremony that they're providing. But there are lots of ways to access that.
Lots of ways to access being heard, seen, and recognized, and lifted up.
Right.
And that's I think a beautiful thing. Have you seen the attitudes in terms of psychedelics and their potential benefits change in the legal community over the last year or so? How do you see things changing over the course of your career, perhaps?
Just from when I started working with entirely underground groups to now seeing people with websites. I mean, that's pretty mind-blowing. When Sacred Plant Alliance first started meeting, we were terrified to all be on Zoom together back in 2020. And now, there's a Psychedelic Bar Association, which is a really great organization for attorneys who are doing work that touches or supports psychedelic use. There are lots of organizations talking about risk reduction or harm reduction services, and incredible organizations that provide those services like Fireside. That the MAPS conference is going to be as big as it is incredible, that there's so much research, thanks to some of the greats like Roland Griffiths and Bob Jesse, is wonderful. And I do think a lot of what's happening in each area is going to support the other. But it's also why it's so important to recognize that we are just one big community supporting a movement, and each individual's actions does have a ripple effect to all the others. We are working right now to change public perception. Like I said, public policy. If the government recognizes that there is good in these substances, will change the law. So education, information, and recognizing that what goes in the media is deeply relevant to perceptions. It's really important, which it puts a lot of responsibility on people in the space right now, and that's good. This is not something to play with. I mean, recreationally, yes, but like if you are offering support for someone, you have to realize the magnitude of what you are doing, that this is a person with their deep, unique experiences. One thing Bob Jesse told me once was that with anyone, there's always a possibility that something can go wrong. You just don't know, depending on the substance, the known and unknown medical conditions of the person, whatever they might have eaten recently, even to whatever kind of emotional experience they might be having recently. And you have to be prepared for the breadth of that. That's a huge responsibility.
Yeah, you never know quite deep how down the rabbit hole they may go, and how many unresolved traumas there might be, or things that might come up, or I think and where the chemistry of that individual's at that particular point, because there is a lot of preparation. If you're going to go into a journey, although there's a lot of mixing and matching and doing all that recreationally, I think in the much more in the therapeutic environment, there's a lot of rigor to, preparing, there's a lot of rigor into going into that. I noticed that you were, the next day you're doing the best practices, but you're also doing this do's and don'ts of filing an RFRA lawsuit, religious claims, use claims, and defenses. legal community perspectives on sacramental psychedelic practices. And you're doing that with Martha Hartney and Jack Silver, right? And that's
Yes.
going to be on Wednesday, the 21st of June.
Correct. The great Martha Hartney and Jack Silver. I'm really excited.
It's wonderful. Can you talk about perhaps any use cases where your legal expertise was critical in protecting some of the rights and, of psychedelic medicine churches or its members, because I'm just wondering, when we start looking at those do's and don'ts, maybe there's a couple that you can share with people who might not be able to make that particular, workshop.
Sure. Well, first, I just want to point to what work Martha and Jack have done. Jack being the attorney for the Santo Daime, who succeeded in the Ninth Circuit, incredibly important case, where they were able to use medical data to show that there was equal amount of information out there showing that ayahuasca was safe to rebut the government's medical information saying it was dangerous, which I think now, with the amount of research that's being done that's in favor of these ceremonial practices, that there's even a stronger argument that could be presented. But Jack paved the way there, and Martha Hartney, who's currently representing the church at Eagle and Condor and doing some really incredible work. I am mostly a transactional attorney, and I like to prepare someone as best as they can to prevent there being such a terrible adverse event that there is litigation. That's my bread and butter. However, I was hired to work with a criminal law attorney in a case in Colorado where I advised and drafted a lot of language around the rights under RFRA, as well as the rights that you could derive for religious use under the Colorado Constitution, despite there not being a state level Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Colorado. And so we got as far as drafting a lot of this language and sharing it. But actually we got very fortunate that Prop 122 passed shortly thereafter, and the charges were dropped. I'd like to hope that part of it was because of all of the hard work that we put into our legal analysis, but I also think we really have to honor the people who put in as much work as they did in Colorado's Prop 122, which did ultimately even retroactively decriminalize use of these substances, possession of those substances in certain situations.
So the best foresight is insight and hindsight, and you're providing it.
Right. I mean, what you have in your filings, whether it be the state filing as an incorporation, as a corporation, in incorporating, or any agreements that you share with participants that may ultimately get to authorities, everything that's on paper can be used in an argument for you, but also used against you, including your website. So please look at your websites. I do a lot of website audits, on behalf of my client to help a client. And you just have to really think about every single little word that you use, because they will use it against you. And you can look at the SoulQuest case where that was what happened. And it was in a case, it was a determination. SoulQuest used the DEA's, they have an application for exemption process, which, there are a lot of questions about how it's being offered and whether it's actually viable and whether they're the right agency to be analyzing if you are religious enough or not. But, just looking to the fact that the DA really harped on the fact meaning SoulQuest, had registered a DBA, meaning an alternate name for their organization, that used the term wellness center. And they said, look, you're a commercial operation, you're wellness, you're not religious. So, even something as little as that, like the language, the name you put on your church, can be, something that the government uses to take you down.
Well, that's very interesting, considering that words have meaning, and that meaning can be taken in a number of ways, for you or against you, and that's what you're helping to neutralize in the process of preparing the organization, looking at all their materials that they share with their members, as well as their processes internally, their bylaws, their ability to go ahead and organize themselves and file, even or ready for file, even if they don't file, right?
Right. And I am hoping one day that, the application process with the DA is viable, that someone is approved, that it becomes a reality. Because, in speaking to churches that do have an exemption, the main thing that the DA focuses on is the diversion aspect. Are you keeping your sacrament locked up? Are you keeping records of how much you're using in each ceremony? And do you still have that amount when they come to do the audit? And that's the main focus. Although my main focus is more about the health and safety to participants, making sure that your helpers are deeply trained in how to react when there's an adverse event, et cetera. So I think you can very precisely focus your operations to best prepare for this kind of circumstance where there is a felony charge brought against you, or there's a threat where they seize your sacrament and you decide that you want to sue because your right to religious exercise is so significantly burdened that you then have to make a choice. And that's what the law focuses on. You should not have to make a choice about whether to engage in religious exercise or obey the law.
Right. So I want to get clear about something. I had a conversation earlier today with another lawyer who told me, and I wasn't aware that this was the case, because I've seen cannabis churches before, but he said to me, basically, cannabis is not covered by the RFRA. He said, because it's in commercial use, and it is a state, it's state, not only state managed, but from a municipal perspective, the municipalities don't recognize RFRA churches specifically in terms of cannabis. Do you have a sense of that? I'm just trying to, I'm wondering if the lawyer had his information right, because I don't know. I've seen that there are RFRA churches that use cannabis as a sacrament. Certainly the Rastafarians do.
Right. And I know some Santo Daime churches, it is, there's ayahuasca and cannabis involved in their rituals. It's like a very familiar practice in Brazil, where it's legal. I was not aware of that.
Maybe this is an offline conversation.
Yeah, I was not aware of that. I would say that you should be able to make a claim. And maybe they're referring to the fact that, the federal RFRA only applies to federal agents, and then there has to be a state level RFRA to apply to state agents, which is pretty important, because generally what I've seen is, local police enforcement that show up at a church. And in that case, if you don't have a state RFRA, they call it mini RFRA, which is very cute, then you don't have that protection. Although, as I said, one argument we were making, and an argument that developed in New Hampshire in a case against an individual named Mac. There was no mini RFRA in New Hampshire, but he said, look, I have this, I think it was psilocybin for religious purposes, and I'm a minister, and this is why I have it. And he showed his, I think it was an ONAC card. And he lost at the trial level, and then he appealed, and they said, you're right. Our state constitution protects the right to religious exercise. In fact, we think it's broader than the federal right to religious exercise. And yes, maybe strict scrutiny should be applied here too. We're going to send this back to the trial court, and the charges were dropped there.
So on a state-by-state level, on a municipal level, the laws can be different. And I think that's an important part, because there are laws, let's say here in New York, where you do need a state, license in order to sell as well as consume. And specifically if you have a consumption lounge, or you have a space where people are consuming cannabis. And in the case of RFRA, I'm not sure how that would work, but it was an interesting sort of sideline, because I knew I was speaking with you today, and I thought, I didn't want to get too sidelined, but I think it's a good point as to why someone would want to make sure they have legal representation in any case.
Absolutely. And I'd say that would be an argument I'd really enjoy researching and writing. Because I think even if there is a system for licensing of distributing cannabis, creating, cultivating cannabis, if someone has a religious belief, that should be protected under the law.
So I know we're running out of time here, and I'm just aware of that. I feel like our time has gone by so quickly. And I know you're doing one other workshop on Friday, the 23rd, on the Sacred Plant Alliance, and you've already talked about some of that. I think that's really very important. But a closing question I might have for you is, looking to the future, what are your hopes and goals for the field of psychedelic medicine law, and what role do you see yourself playing in advancing this critical work? Obviously, you've done the book, you're involved with all these conferences, and I'm just wondering, where do you see things going? Because some people are very concerned that it would be sort of going by way of cannabis, which has a much more sort of, Wild West kind of perspective. It's not yet, it's commercial, and yet at the same point there are dispensaries where you do need a medical card and so on and so forth. But I'm just wondering, from your view, where do you think this is going, and what are your concerns in terms of how we get there?
I mean, looking at cannabis is such a great example. Where it's been so regulated that it's still not accessible for legacy growers. I think unless the regulation coming out is broad enough, the gray market will still exist. And we see that with cannabis. There are stores in New York City that have been operating for over a year, and you walk in, it's beautiful. They've got little glass containers of cannabis. They're not legal, but they are operating, and they're more accessible. A lot of the time they're cheaper. They're going to succeed. And I think it's the same in psychedelics, that if you don't make it accessible, and if you don't make it so that legacy, long-standing individuals with lineage, with decades of experience in supporting people in these experiences, if they're not brought to the table in a way that makes sense, then they'll just keep doing what they're doing. And I think that doesn't benefit them, and it doesn't benefit the participants. There are ways to enforce a system that makes it safe without making it so impossible to function inside of. And there are a lot of realities that we have to overcome. We have to see medical boards recognize these uses that would make people with licenses able to operate in the space. We have to see more education of the public and understanding, and less stigma. So people need to talk about their experiences that are positive. And I'm so grateful for those individuals, particularly veterans, who are coming forward and talking about how psychedelics have saved their lives. People with opiate addictions coming forward and talking about how it saved their lives. And then also people who have experienced bad trips to come forward and say, this is what went wrong. Let's do it better next time. If we don't open up that space to have those conversations, we won't get better. We won't be better at this. Right. And, what I'm doing is continuing to support the people that I feel are doing it right. I always look to safety and sincerity, and experience, a lot of experience with the work. And also what we're doing at Sacred Plant Alliance is absolutely amazing. I can't believe I get to be part of it. We're hoping to see more experienced churches reach out and, decide to be just enough at the ground level, not fully above ground, because I know that's a difficult transition to make, but to come join us and help us work together on developing best practices and being supportive of one another in this container. And I'm trying to do more work with policy at state level. And basically, I just keep saying yes to things that are, keeping me as tired as I am, but as excited as I am about this work.
Well, thank you very, very, very much for Sacred Plant Alliance, for the work you're doing in leading the charge in this really crucial area. I think so many people have a yearning and a hunger in their soul to really connect at a very deep, profound level. And I believe that the work that you're doing allows them to do that without the majesty, if you will, of the traditional church, which can, for many people, be very oppressive. Right. And whatever their background is, I think there's room for everyone at the table. So I thank you very much, Allison Hoots, for being present and being at the conference. If people want to get a hold of you in the meantime and read up about you, certainly it's Allison Hoots, Hoots, ALLISON. That's my granddaughter's name. But how would they wind up getting a hold of you, and what should they look for? I'm on LinkedIn, so you could contact me there as you and I connected there. And then my website is Hoots Law Practice, which is where I'm an attorney. And you can email me there. I think there's a contact form, or just ahoots@hootslawpractice.com. Right. And of course, look for your book on RFRA
yes.
guidelines with Chacruna.
Chacruna
Institute. That's right. I always have a hard time with that. I apologize with that.
No worries.
Chacruna, I think a lot of people do.
Chacruna, yeah, Chacruna, which is one of the components in ayahuasca.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. I continue to learn even at my age. So I thank you very much again. And we'll see you at the convention, yes?
Thank you so much for having me, Keith. This was such a delight. And I will see you there.
Thank you for listening to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. We have other exciting guests coming up in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. For more mindfulness tips and tricks, visit our website at workmindfulness.com. Thanks again for being a part of the Mindfulness Experience. This is Keith Fiveson.